My daughter's future in-laws flew in from Europe to meet us. They spoke French the whole dinner, thinking he wouldn't understand. Then I heard what they said about my daughter, and I set down my fork. Couldn't stay silent any longer. My daughter's future in-laws flew in from Europe to meet us, and for 2 hours over dinner they spoke French the entire time, certain I couldn't understand a word of it. I remember the specific weight of that evening even now, the candles burning down lower than I'd planned for, the particular quality of autumn light fading outside our dining room windows, the sound of my own heartbeat rising steadily louder in my ears, as I listened to two people discuss my daughter's worth like an asset being appraised, in a language they assumed bought them complete privacy at my own table. I let them believe that for exactly as long as it served me. Then I heard what Henri Rousseau said about my daughter, the words convenient, temporary, and she won't last the year, strung together in a sentence so casual he didn't even lower his voice for it. And I set down my fork. I hadn't spoken French out loud in 19 years. I hadn't needed to, but some sentences, you don't forget how to say, no matter how long you've buried the person who used to say them. Actually, I said, in French clean enough that Solange Rousseau's wineglass stopped halfway to her mouth. I understood every word, including the ones about the vineyard in 2003. Would you like to discuss those next? Or should we finish dinner first? The silence that followed lasted long enough that my daughter's fork clattered against her plate. My name is Margot Chastain, Maggie, to almost everyone who's known me since I moved back to the States. And there was a version of my life, a long time ago, that none of my American friends, my husband, or even my own daughter knew anything about. It wasn't a secret I kept out of shame exactly. It was a secret I kept because some doors, once you close them, feel dangerous to open again, even just to check what's still inside. I grew up outside Albany, the daughter of a high school French teacher who filled our house with language tapes, and a stubborn belief that fluency was a kind of freedom. My father, Walter, taught French at the same public high school for 31 years, the kind of teacher former students still stopped him to thank at the grocery store decades later, and he raised me on a particular philosophy he repeated often, enough that I could probably recite it in my sleep, that learning another language wasn't really about vocabulary or grammar at all, but about giving yourself somewhere else to stand when the room you were in got too small to hold what you needed to say. I didn't understand what he meant, not really, until I was 22 years old in a stranger's dining room in Reims, translating sentences I didn't want to be translating, and finally understood that the freedom he'd always described could just as easily become a kind of trap if you used it to hide instead of to speak. It took me 19 more years, and one dinner at my own table, to finally use that freedom, the way he'd always meant it. My mother, Renata, worked as a hospital administrator for most of my childhood, sturdy and practical, in a way that balanced my father's more romantic notions about language and freedom. She was the one who drove me to the airport the day I left for France at 22, and I remember her, standing at the gate before security, in the way you still could back then, telling me only, notice everything, and don't be afraid to say what you notice. I thought about that instruction often, in the years after I came home, wondering whether I'd failed it more thoroughly than I'd ever admitted to her. I went to college for translation and interpretation, and at 22, with more ambition than sense, I took a job as an au pair and part-time translator for a family. Outside Reims, in the heart of Champagne country, working for a negociant house with 3 centuries of history behind its name and a very particular relationship with the truth. The house was called Maison Rousseau. I didn't know when I took the job from a listing in a translation newsletter that it belonged to the same family my daughter would one day fall in love with, 20 years and an ocean away from where any of it started. I worked for Henri Rousseau's father, Etienne Rousseau the Elder, the man my daughter's fiancé would later be named for, in the last 2 years before he handed the business fully to his son. I was hired to translate correspondence with American and British importers, to sit in on negotiations, and make sure nothing was lost in either direction, and, increasingly, to help smooth over a growing number of questions from buyers about certain lots of wine that didn't quite match the vintage on the label. I was 22. I told myself, for longer than I'm proud of, that I simply didn't understand enough about the wine business to know what I was looking at. I understood more than I let myself admit. There were ledgers I translated that referenced blending bulk wine from outside the appellation into bottles labeled with vintages and vineyard names that legally required something far more specific and far more expensive. There were phone calls I sat in on, translating for confused American distributors, where old Etienne Rousseau used me, my careful, willing English, to reassure buyers that a particular shipment's inconsistent quality was simply the character of the terroir that year. When the ledgers upstairs told an entirely different story. I raised it once, quietly, to the house's longtime accountant, a soft-spoken man named Faucher, who had worked for the family since before I was born. He looked at me with something between pity and warning and said, in French, Mademoiselle, you are 22 years old, and very far from home. Some things are easier to translate than to understand. Choose which one your job actually is. Those 2 years held more than the ledgers, though the ledgers are what came back to me first and hardest, the night of that dinner. I remember the enormous stone kitchen, where the household staff ate lunch together. The particular way morning light came through the shutters of the small apartment I rented above. The old stable block, a boy from the village named Julien, who taught me to ride a bicycle properly on the gravel paths between the vine rows, because I'd never learned as a child. I remember old Etienne Rousseau's genuine warmth toward me in every context that had nothing to do with the business. The way he'd insist I join family dinners on Sundays, ask careful, curious questions about my father's teaching career back in New York, seem, in every way that didn't touch the ledgers, like a decent and generous man. That contradiction is, I think, the part I never fully resolved, even after I left. It would have been simpler, in its own way, if he'd been cruel in every direction. Instead, he was warm to me personally, and quietly dishonest in his business. And at 22, I didn't yet have the vocabulary to hold both of those truths about the same person at once. I chose to remember the warmth, and file the ledgers away as something separate, something that belonged to a version of the business I wasn't responsible for and couldn't change anyway. There is one specific afternoon from those 2 years that came back to me, with unusual clarity, the night of Camille's engagement dinner, though I hadn't thought about it in years before that. An American importer, a heavy-set good-natured man from Ohio named Robert Kessler, had flown to Reims, specifically to walk the vineyard rows himself, before finalizing a large order, the kind of buyer who took real pride in knowing exactly where his wine came from. Old Etienne Rousseau asked me to accompany them both on the walk, to translate, and to make sure Kessler's questions were answered in a way he could properly appreciate. We walked for nearly 2 hours. Kessler asked detailed, careful questions about specific parcels, about which slopes produced which character of fruit, about a vintage he'd be putting his own name behind to distributors back home. I translated Etienne's answers faithfully, sentence by sentence, watching Kessler nod along, genuinely moved by what he believed he was being shown. What I didn't say, because it wasn't technically a lie in any single sentence I translated, was that a meaningful portion of what Kessler would eventually receive in bottles bearing that specific vintage and vineyard name had, according to the ledgers I'd read the week before, actually come from parcels 30 kilometers away, purchased in bulk from growers outside the appellation entirely. Kessler shook both our hands warmly at the end of that walk, and told Etienne, through me, that he felt lucky to have found a house with this kind of integrity. I remember translating that sentence, and feeling something twist uncomfortably in my chest, a discomfort I filed away, the way I filed everything away that summer, under the heading of, not my scandal to carry. I chose translation. I told myself, at 22, that it wasn't my scandal to carry. I finished my 2 years, took excellent references, and came home to New York, with a fluency in French, and a fluency in looking away that I didn't examine closely again for a very long time. I met my husband Daniel, 8 months after I came home. I built a life with him that had nothing to do with champagne, or ledgers, or a young woman's decision to translate a lie rather than name it. We had our daughter, Camille, 3 years later. I let the French mostly go quiet in me, the way a language does when you stop needing it. Not gone, just folded up small and put away in a drawer I didn't open. I never told Daniel the specifics of those 2 years. I told him, when he asked, that I'd worked for a wine family, and it hadn't ended particularly well, and left it there, and he, kind, incurious in exactly the way I needed at the time, never pushed for more. I certainly never imagined that drawer would come open again, at my own daughter's engagement dinner. At the hands of the very family whose ledgers I had once quietly, carefully, chosen not to read too closely. Camille met Etienne Rousseau, the younger, named for his grandfather, current heir to the same Maison Rousseau I had once worked inside of, at a wine industry conference in Chicago 3 years ago. She works in beverage marketing, sharp and unguarded in a way I've always envied, and she came home from that conference talking about a French vintner's son who'd made her laugh so hard during a panel discussion that she'd had to leave the room. She called me from her hotel room that same night, practically breathless, describing how he'd found her afterward in the hallway to apologize, unprompted, for a comment one of the other panelists had made that he thought had been dismissive of her question. He didn't have to say anything, she told me. Nobody else on that stage even noticed. He noticed, and he cared enough to come find me and say something about it. I remember thinking at the time that it was a small, lovely detail to build 3 years of a relationship on, and I didn't think much more about it beyond being glad she'd met someone kind. Their relationship grew slowly across an ocean for the first year, built on long calls at odd hours to accommodate the time difference, on Etienne flying to see her every 6 or 7 weeks, on Camille teaching herself enough basic French, in fits and starts on a language app, to order dinner correctly the first time she visited him in Reims. She never once asked me for help with any of it, and I never once offered, telling myself, again, that the chapter of my life connected to that language belonged somewhere else entirely. I didn't put the name together right away. Rousseau is not an uncommon name in that part of France, and Camille never mentioned Reims specifically in those first months. Only the Champagne region, only his family's house, only small glowing details about a man who seemed, by every account she gave me, genuinely kind. It was almost a year into their relationship before Camille showed me a photo from a visit to his family's estate, and I recognized, with a jolt that traveled straight down my spine, the same stone gatehouse I used to walk through every morning at 22, the same iron gate with the same Rousseau family crest worked into it that I hadn't seen in 19 years. I said nothing. I told myself, the way I'd told myself so many things at 22, that it didn't matter now. That whatever I'd translated and chosen not to examine 2 decades earlier belonged to a version of the family, and a version of the business, that had likely changed entirely under new ownership and new practices. Old Etienne Rousseau, I assumed, was long retired, if not gone altogether. Whatever I knew, or half knew, or had deliberately not let myself fully know, felt like ancient history standing next to my daughter's obvious happiness. I wanted, very badly, to be wrong about needing to say anything at all. The engagement dinner had been 8 months in the planning by the time Henri and Solange Rousseau finally flew in from France. Camille and Etienne had been engaged for 4 months by then, and this was to be the first time both families met in person at our house outside Albany, on a Saturday evening in late September. I threw myself into preparing for it the way I throw myself into anything I'm nervous about, completely, almost aggressively. I relearned recipes I hadn't made in years. I bought wine glasses that Daniel joked cost more than our actual dinner. I spent an embarrassing number of hours online trying to determine whether a French champagne house of Maison Rousseau's supposed prestige would consider our modest dining room charming or simply modest, and never quite landed on an answer that made me stop worrying. Camille, for her part, was radiant with nerves in the good way, the way you're nervous before something you actually want to go well. "They're going to love you, Mom," she told me the morning of the dinner, hugging me in the kitchen while I checked the oven for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Etienne says his father can be a little formal at first, but his mother's warm once she relaxes. I smiled and told her I was sure it would be lovely, and didn't mention the small, cold feeling that had been sitting under my ribs for months, waiting for a name I hadn't yet let myself say out loud, even to myself. I spent that entire final afternoon finding reasons to walk past the hallway mirror, checking and rechecking my own reflection, the way you do when you're not entirely sure which version of yourself is about to answer the door. I'd chosen a navy dress I'd worn exactly once before, to a cousin's retirement dinner, plain enough that I hoped it read as tasteful rather than trying too hard, though I changed my mind about the earrings twice, and my mind about the earrings a 3rd time after that. Daniel found me in the bathroom around 5, adjusting a bracelet that didn't need adjusting, and told me, gently, that I'd been running my hands over the same 3 inches of countertop for the better part of an hour, without cleaning anything. I spent nearly as much time that afternoon on the meal itself as I did on my own appearance, driven by a nervous energy I couldn't fully explain even to myself. I'd tested the chicken recipe twice in the preceding week, adjusting the lemon each time until it tasted the way I remembered certain dinners tasting in Reims decades earlier, a detail I didn't examine too closely. At the time, though looking back I think some part of me was unconsciously trying to recreate a version of that warmth I'd once felt at old Etienne Rousseau's table, before I understood what sat quietly beneath it. I just wanted to go well for her, I told him, which was true, though it wasn't the whole truth, and some part of me knew even then that the cold feeling under my ribs had less to do with hosting anxiety, and more to do with a gatehouse and an iron gate I hadn't let myself think about in years. "It's going to go well," Daniel said, "because our daughter is happy, and any parent who can't see that in about 4 minutes isn't worth losing sleep over." I let myself believe him, mostly, for the length of time it took to hear the car pull into our driveway. Henri and Solange Rousseau arrived exactly on time, which I would later understand to be its own kind of statement. Henri was tall, silver-haired, dressed in the particular understated way of men who've never once needed to prove they have money. Solange was elegant in a manner that made my carefully chosen outfit feel, instantly, slightly wrong, though she was gracious enough on the surface that it took me most of the appetizer course to realize how deliberately every one of her compliments carried a small, precise edge. "What a charming little house," she said, glancing around our dining room in a way that made little do a great deal of work. "So cozy. We don't really have houses this size in our part of France. Everything is so much older there, you understand, so much more space." I smiled, and said something about how we liked it, and refilled her wine, and told myself, again, that I was imagining things. Etienne, to his enormous credit, seemed almost apologetic for his parents from the first 10 minutes, catching Camille's eye more than once, with a look that clearly meant something like "I told you," and reaching for her hand under the table, when his mother made a comment about how American portions were so generous, while looking pointedly at the size of the roast I'd spent 4 hours preparing. There were other small moments before the French began, moments I recognized even then as small tests, disguised as conversation. Solange asked Camille, with apparent lightness, whether she intended to keep working after the wedding, in a tone that made the question feel less like curiosity and more like an inventory being taken. Henri asked Daniel a series of careful questions about our finances, disguised as interest in his career. What exactly a structural engineer's firm billed for a project our size, whether Daniel had ever considered something larger. Questions Daniel answered good-naturedly, without apparently noticing they were questions at all. I noticed. I'd spent 2 years of my life learning to notice exactly that kind of question, dressed up as small talk, actually gathering information for a ledger somewhere I wasn't allowed to see. Camille, glowing and oblivious to all of it in the particular way happy people are oblivious to undertones aimed at people other than themselves, kept the conversation moving with stories about how she and Etienne met, about the wedding venue they'd finally settled on, about a honeymoon itinerary through Portugal, that Solange sniffed at gently as a bit touristic, before recommending, unprompted, 3 specific hotels in the south of France instead. I recognized Henri before he recognized me, or at least before he recognized me fully. There was a flicker of something in his expression. When Daniel introduced me by my married name, Maggie Chastain, a half-second pause I might have missed if I hadn't spent 2 years of my life learning to read every small hesitation that crossed his father's face across a negotiating table. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. I told myself, for the second time that night, that I was imagining it. The trouble started somewhere around the main course, when Henri and Solange, comfortable by then with several glasses of the champagne they'd brought as a gift, slipped into French with each other in the easy, unconscious way people do when they assume no one else at the table can follow along. At first it was small talk. A comment about the flight, a complaint about American customs agents, a brief, irritated exchange about whether they'd packed the right shoes for the provincial weather. I let it wash past me, translating automatically in my head the way you can't stop yourself from doing once you've spent 2 years living inside a language. Then the conversation drifted, the way idle French between 2 comfortable people always seems to drift, toward the wedding planning itself. Solange mentioned to Henri that she'd already spoken privately with a lawyer in Reims about protective arrangements for the family's assets, should the marriage not prove durable. Henri agreed this was prudent, adding that Etienne in his experience had always been sentimental, And that sentimentality in matters of money had a way of costing a family more than anyone anticipated at the start. I felt my stomach tighten at the casualness of it, the two of them discussing the dissolution of a marriage that hadn't even happened yet, over my own dining table, while my daughter sat 3 feet away beaming at her fiancé. Then Solange said, glancing across the table at Camille with a smile that never once slipped, "Elle est jolie, au moins. Ça aidera pour les photos du mariage." She's pretty at least. That will help for the wedding photos. Henri responded, low enough that he clearly assumed it was safely beneath anyone's notice. Jolie ne suffira pas quand l'argent de la famille sera parti. Tu sais comment ça se passe avec ces mariages américains. Un an, peut être deux. Et puis il reviendra. Pretty won't be enough once the family money runs out. You know how it goes with these American marriages. A year, maybe 2, and then he'll come back. I felt my hand tighten around my fork. Solange laughed softly, the sound of a woman entirely certain no one at the table could touch her. Au moins elle est plus docile que la dernière. Celle-là posait trop de questions sur les comtesses. At least she's more docile than the last one. That one asked too many questions about the accounts. Henri chuckled at that, a low, satisfied sound, and added something further, almost as an aside. About how his own mother, the grandmother I never met, gone now for over a decade, had always said that a family's peace depended on knowing which women could be trusted to stay quiet, and which ones needed to be quietly managed, until they learned. I felt something cold settle deeper in my chest at that, understanding, even before the next sentence arrived, that I was listening to 3 generations of the same instinct passed down at once, each one a little more polished than the last, a little more comfortable delivering it in front of an audience assumed incapable of understanding. Henri's next sentence was the one that finally broke something loose in me, delivered with the same casual, unhurried tone he might have used to discuss the weather. Elle ne durera pas de toute façon. Elle n'est pas assez forte pour survivre dans notre monde. Elle finira comme sa mère, probablement, une gentille petite américaine qui ne comprend rien à ce qu'elle a signé. She won't last anyway. She isn't strong enough to survive in our world. She'll end up like her mother, probably. A sweet little American who doesn't understand anything she's signed. I felt, in that instant, 19 years collapse into a single point. The 22-year-old translator, who'd once sat quietly through conversations exactly like this one, and the 41-year-old mother who is no longer willing to. I thought, absurdly, of Faucher's voice, from 2 decades earlier, asking me to choose which job I actually had. I thought of Robert Kessler's warm, trusting handshake at the end of that long vineyard walk. I thought, most of all, of my daughter, 3 feet away, still smiling at something Etienne had whispered to her moments earlier, entirely unaware that she was being appraised and dismissed in real time by the 2 people who would, God willing, be raising her own children's grandparents. I set down my fork. I set down my fork slowly, deliberately. The way you move when you need your body to catch up with a decision your mind has already made without asking permission. The clatter of it against the china was small, but it landed in that room like a gunshot. Because for the first time in 20 minutes, I wasn't smiling along with something I didn't understand. Actually, I said, in French clean and unhurried enough that Solange's wine glass stopped halfway to her mouth. I understood every word of that, all of it. The table went silent in a way I have never experienced before or since, not merely quiet but suspended, as though the room itself had stopped breathing to listen. Camille's fork clattered against her plate. Daniel, who doesn't speak a word of French, looked between us with the confused, alert expression of a man who knows something has gone terribly wrong but hasn't yet been told what. Henri recovered first, the way men like him always do, smoothing his expression back into something diplomatic within a second and a half. Madame Chastain, I meant no. You meant exactly what you said, I told him, still in French, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. You said my daughter is pretty enough for wedding photos, that she won't last once the money runs out, that she's more docile than someone who apparently asked too many questions about your accounts once, and that she'll end up like her mother, a sweet little American who doesn't understand anything she's signed. I switched to English for the last part, so that Camille and Daniel could hear it directly from me, without translation, without any softening on my part or theirs. Every single word of that, in front of my daughter, At her own engagement dinner. Camille's face had gone pale. Mom? You speak French? I lived in France for 2 years, I said. I worked for a wine house outside Reims. I translated contracts, correspondence, negotiations. I looked directly at Henri. I worked for your father, Etienne Rousseau the Elder. I was 22 years old and I sat in that dining room translating his calls to American distributors for 2 years, Henri. I know exactly who this family is when they think no one in the room can understand them. The silence that followed was different from the first one, heavier, more dangerous. The silence of two people rapidly recalculating everything they thought they knew about the evening they'd walked into. Solange set her wineglass down with exaggerated care, as though the sound of it might give something else away. I don't know what you think you remember, Henri said carefully, still in English now, his accent thickening slightly, the way accents do under real pressure. But it was a very long time ago. My father is retired. Whatever business practices existed, then have nothing to do with the house today. That's an interesting thing to say, I told him. For a man who just told his wife, in a language he assumed I couldn't follow, that my daughter would end up like her mother, not understanding anything she'd signed. That's a very specific insult, Henri, almost as if it came from personal experience, with exactly that kind of arrangement. Etienne, my daughter's fiancé, who had been sitting in stunned silence through all of this, finally spoke, his voice tight with an anger that surprised me, directed entirely at his own father. Papa, what is she talking about? What accounts? Henri didn't answer. It was Solange who broke first, her composure cracking in a way I suspect surprised her more than anyone else at the table. It's nothing that concerns the children, Henri. Tell them it's nothing. It's clearly something, Etienne said. If my future mother-in-law knows enough to bring it up at dinner. I looked at my daughter's fiancé. A young man I had liked, genuinely, from the very first time Camille brought him home, who had never once, in 3 years, given me a single reason to doubt his character, and made a decision I hadn't fully planned to make, until that exact moment. I'm not here to destroy your family's business over something that happened 20 years ago, I told him, and I meant it, at least in that moment. I'm here because I just listened to your parents discuss my daughter like she's a temporary inconvenience they're tolerating for the sake of appearances. That's the only thing that matters to me tonight. Camille, to her enormous credit, found her voice before anyone else at the table managed to. She stood, her chair scraping back hard enough that it nearly tipped, and looked directly at Solange. Docile, she repeated, in English, testing the word like it tasted wrong in her mouth. You called me docile, compared to some other woman who asked too many questions about the accounts. She looked at Etienne. Is that someone I should know about? Etienne's jaw tightened. It was years ago, before you. It's not, Camille, I promise you, it has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us, Camille said. If your parents are sitting at my mother's table calculating how long I'll last before you come back to whoever that was. Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, not from weakness, but from the particular fury of realizing you've been condescended to by people smiling at you the entire time. Henri, perhaps sensing the evening slipping entirely out of his control, tried one more time for damage control, his tone shifting into something more conciliatory. Please, this is a misunderstanding born of language, nothing more. Perhaps things sound harsher in translation than they were intended. I didn't translate anything, I said. I understood you perfectly, in the original. There's no translation to blame here, Henri. Just 20 minutes of you and your wife saying exactly what you think of my daughter, in a language you assumed bought you privacy. Dinner ended, less than 20 minutes later, in the particular, stilted formal way that disasters end among people too polite to simply walk out. Solange claimed a headache. Henri spoke in clipped, careful English about jet lag and time zones, and the two of them left for their hotel with a haste that fooled absolutely no one at the table. Etienne stayed. He sat in our living room until nearly midnight, Camille curled against his side on the couch, both of them working through what had just happened in the particular exhausted, circling way people do when a single dinner has upended something they thought they understood about their own family. He'd barely spoken during the drive back from seeing his parents off, Camille told me later, staring out the passenger window for most of the 20 minutes. And when he finally did speak, in our driveway, before they'd even come inside. It was to apologize. Not for his parents' words, which he said plainly weren't his to apologize for, but for the 29 years he'd spent inside that family, without ever once questioning why certain relatives seemed to quietly vanish from gatherings. Why his Aunt Delphine's name came up so rarely. Why business conversations always stopped abruptly whenever he wandered into a room as a child. "I think I always sensed something was being kept from me," he told Camille in the driveway. "And I think I decided somewhere along the way that it was easier not to ask." "I need you to tell me everything," Etienne said to me finally, somewhere around 11. "Not the short version. Whatever you actually know about my grandfather's business, and whoever that woman was my father mentioned. I'd rather hear it from you tonight than spend the next 6 months hearing pieces of it from my parents whenever it's convenient for them." So I told him. All of it. The ledgers, the blended bulk wine sold under vintage labels that legally required something entirely different, the phone calls where I translated reassurances I knew, even at 22, weren't entirely true. I told him about Faucher, the old accountant who'd told me to choose which job I actually had. I told him I'd chosen wrong, and left, and buried the entire chapter of my life so deep that I hadn't spoken more than a handful of French words out loud in 19 years. Until tonight. Etienne listened without interrupting, his expression shifting slowly from disbelief to something heavier, something that looked almost like grief for an idea of his family he was watching dissolve in real time. "My grandfather died 4 years ago," he said finally. "I always thought the house's reputation was built on nothing but quality. My father talks about our centuries of integrity, like it's scripture." He laughed, short and humorless. "I suppose I should have wondered why he gets so uncomfortable whenever anyone asks detailed questions about the early 2000s. "I'm not telling you this to hurt you," I said. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because I think you deserve to know exactly what kind of pressure your parents might put on Camille once the wedding gets closer. If they're capable of dismissing her worth to her face at dinner, I need you to understand what else they might be capable of. Quietly. Later." Daniel found me in the kitchen around 1 in the morning, long after Etienne had finally driven back to his hotel, and Camille had gone quiet behind her bedroom door. I was standing at the sink, not washing anything, just standing. "You never told me any of that," he said, not accusing, just quietly working through it the way he works through most things. 20 years of marriage. And I never knew you spoke French well enough to catch something like that in real time." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. It felt like a door I'd shut a long time ago, and I didn't see the point in opening it again for something that felt over." "It clearly wasn't over," he said, not unkindly. "Maggie, I've watched you flinch every single time someone's mentioned Reims or champagne for 19 years, and I always assumed it was just a bad breakup you didn't want to discuss. I never once imagined you were sitting on something like this." "Would it have changed anything," I asked, "if I'd told you sooner?" He thought about it for a long moment. "Maybe not what happened tonight," he said finally. "But maybe I could have understood you a little better, all these years, instead of just accepting that there was a part of you I wasn't allowed to ask about." I didn't have a good answer for that. I still don't, entirely. I only know that standing in my own kitchen at 1 in the morning, finally saying the words out loud to my own husband, felt like setting down a weight I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. I called my own mother a few days later, driving to her house rather than explaining it over the phone, needing to say it in person, the way you need to say certain things face to face. Renata listened to the entire account without interrupting, the same steady, practical listening she'd given me my whole life, and when I finished, she didn't ask why I'd kept it from her for 19 years, which was the question I'd been bracing for the whole drive over. Instead she said, "I always wondered what happened in those 2 years that made you come home different. You'd left so certain of everything, and you came back so much more careful. I assumed it was simply growing up. I didn't realize you'd come home carrying something specific." "I didn't want you to worry," I told her, "and I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that I'd known something was wrong and chosen not to say anything about it." She reached over and took my hand, the same gesture she'd used at the airport gate the day I left for France at 22. "You were 22 years old, in another country, with no power in that house beyond your own conscience. You did what most 22-year-olds would do in that position. What matters is what you did at 41, when you finally had the power to say something, and a reason worth saying it for. She squeezed my hand once. I'd say you more than made up for it. Camille barely slept that night. I heard her moving around her old childhood bedroom past 2 in the morning, and finally went in and sat on the edge of her bed the way I used to when she was small and couldn't settle after a nightmare. Did you know, she asked me quietly, when I first told you his last name, did you know it was them? Not for certain, I admitted. Not until you showed me the photo of the gatehouse. After that I suspected. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I told myself I was protecting you by staying quiet, but really, Cam, I think I was protecting myself. I didn't want to open that door again. You should have told me, she said, and there was more hurt in her voice than anger, which somehow made it worse. I know, I said. I'm sorry. I spent 19 years telling myself that chapter of my life was over, and I think some part of me needed it to stay that way so badly that I let my own daughter walk toward the exact same family without a single warning. Camille was quiet for a while after that, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something angrier, though not directed at me. I keep thinking about all the small things I brushed past this year, she said. The way Solange always asked about my job like she was quietly cataloging whether I was ambitious enough to be worth the family's time. The way Henri asked Dad those strange specific questions about the firm's billing. I noticed all of it, Mom. I just told myself I was being paranoid or ungenerous because Etienne was so wonderful that I didn't want to believe his family could be anything less. That's not a failure on your part, I told her. That's exactly what falling in love with someone's family often looks like from the inside. You give people the benefit of the doubt because the person you love asked you to, implicitly, just by loving them. It doesn't make you naive. It makes you generous. There's a difference, even when it doesn't feel like one in the moment. Camille was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. Do you think Etienne's like them? No, I said. And I meant it. I think Etienne is furious right now, and I think that fury is entirely on your behalf, which tells me a great deal about the kind of husband he's going to be. But I also think you deserve to know exactly what you're marrying into before you sign a single piece of paper, Cam. Not to scare you away from him, to make sure nothing about this marriage happens to you instead of with you. Camille told me, weeks later, about a conversation she'd had with Etienne during that same difficult stretch, lying awake together in his hotel room the night after they'd first confronted Henri with Delphine's documents. She'd asked him, point blank, whether he was worried he might turn out like his father, capable of quiet silence in the face of family cruelty, the way Henri had clearly learned to be silent in the face of his own father's fraud. He didn't get defensive, Camille told me. He just thought about it for a long time, and then he said, I think the only way I avoid becoming him is if I keep choosing, deliberately, every single day to say the uncomfortable thing instead of the comfortable one. I don't think it's a decision you make once. I think it's one you have to keep making. She'd found that answer more reassuring, she said, than any promise he could have made her. Anyone can promise they'll never be like their parents. It takes something else entirely to actually understand that it's a choice you have to keep renewing. She told me too that the conversation had made her think differently about her own inheritance from me. Not the language itself, but the particular habit of choosing, again and again, whether to speak or stay quiet. I used to think you were just naturally braver than most people, she said. Now I think maybe it's less about being naturally brave and more about deciding over and over that the discomfort of speaking is worth less than the cost of staying silent. I think that's actually a more useful thing to have learned from you than if you'd simply been born fearless. I want to describe, too, the ordinary weeks that followed that dinner, because I think it's easy, telling a story like this one, to make it sound as though every day after that Saturday was consumed entirely by ledgers and lawyers and confrontations in French chateaux. Most days, in truth, looked exactly like they had before. Ordinary work at my small translation side business that I'd kept going part-time for years. Dinners with Daniel, where we didn't discuss Reims at all, because there was, on any given Tuesday, simply nothing new to discuss. Camille went back to her marketing job 3 days after the dinner, needing the ordinary shape of a workday to hold her together while the rest of her life reorganized itself around a single sentence overheard in French. Her closest colleague, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priya, The same friend Camille had called before flying to Lyon, covered 2 of her client calls that first week. Without being asked, the way good friends do when they can tell, without needing details, that someone needs an afternoon they don't have to perform composure through. Priya came to stay with us for a weekend about a month after the dinner, ostensibly to help Camille plan a fall trip that never ended up happening, though I think the real purpose of the visit was simply to sit with her through the parts of this that weren't dramatic enough to tell anyone else about. The small waves of doubt that hit at odd hours, the exhaustion of holding 2 versions of Etienne's family in her head at once, the one who'd said those words at our table, and the one who'd gotten on a plane the next weekend to make it right. I overheard part of their conversation from the kitchen that first evening. Camille finally explaining the full scope of it to Priya for the first time. Not just the slap of the insult itself, but the ledgers, my own history in Reims, the strange, layered inheritance of silence running through an entire family. Priya, characteristically direct, asked the question I suspect had been sitting under most people's polite condolences all along. So, is the wedding actually still happening, or are we all just being nice about it right now? It's happening, Camille told her, without hesitation. I'm not marrying his parents, Priya. I'm marrying a man who got on a plane the second he found out what they'd built, and spent the next 6 months tearing it apart rather than protect it. That's not nothing. That's actually everything I need to know about him. I made them both dinner that Saturday, and left them alone on the back porch for most of the evening, catching only fragments through the kitchen window. Camille's laugh, unguarded, for what felt like the first time in weeks, Priya's low, steady voice offering something that clearly helped, whatever it was. Daniel, for his part, threw himself into fixing things he could actually fix, in the way I've come to understand, is simply how he processes anything he can't control directly. He rebuilt the fence along our property line that fall, a project he'd been putting off for 2 years, and told me, without much prompting, that it felt good to finish something completely, start to finish, while so much of what our daughter was navigating remained genuinely uncertain. Over the following 2 weeks, what had started as a single, humiliating dinner slowly unfolded into something much larger, in the particular way these things tend to once you finally stop looking away from them. Etienne, to his credit, drove to Reims himself the following weekend. A rare, unannounced visit that clearly rattled his parents more than anything I'd said at the table. He came back with a version of events that confirmed most of what I remembered, and added a piece I hadn't known. The woman who asked too many questions about the accounts his father had mentioned wasn't a stranger at all. She was Etienne's own aunt, Henri's younger sister, Delphine Rousseau, who had briefly worked in the family business's finance department in her 20s, before abruptly leaving the industry entirely and moving to Lyon, where she now taught economics at a regional university, and as far as the rest of the family was concerned, was simply not suited to the wine business. Etienne tracked her down through an old family address book his mother kept in a drawer, and called her directly, without telling his parents first. She cried on the phone, he told me, sitting at our kitchen table 2 days later, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. She said she'd found discrepancies in the export ledgers almost identical to what you described. She raised it with my grandfather directly. He told her it wasn't her place to question decisions that had kept the family business running for 3 generations. When she pushed further, she was quietly moved out of finance, and eventually, out of the company altogether, with enough of a settlement attached that she signed an agreement not to discuss it publicly. She's been carrying that alone for over 15 years, I said. She said something I haven't stopped thinking about, Etienne said. She said, I always wondered if there'd ever be someone else who saw it and didn't look away. I hadn't planned to get involved any further than that single dinner. I told myself, for the first several days afterward, that I'd said what needed saying, that Camille and Etienne could handle the rest of it as the adults they were, that my job had simply been to stop pretending I hadn't understood what I'd heard. But Delphine Rousseau called me directly, 3 days after her conversation with Etienne, having gotten my number from him with my permission. Her English was excellent, careful, the English of someone who has spent years being precise in a language that isn't quite her own. I understand you worked for my father, she said. In the finance office, or close to it. Translation, mostly, I told her, but I saw enough of the ledgers to understand what I was translating. There was a long pause on the line. I have documents, she said finally. Copies I kept, against the advice of the lawyer who negotiated my settlement, because some part of me always suspected I might need them someday. I never used them. I was frightened, and I was 26, and my entire family made it very clear what it would cost me to speak further. Another pause. I think, perhaps, the time for being frightened has passed. We spoke for nearly 2 hours that first call. Delphine described a practice that hadn't ended with old Etienne Rousseau's retirement at all. It had simply evolved, grown more careful, moved into a gray area of blending permitted under certain regional rules but stretched, consistently, right up against the edge of what was legal, particularly for exports to markets like the American one, where enforcement was thinner and buyers were less likely to ask the kinds of questions a French regulatory body might. My brother inherited the business, Delphine said, and he inherited the practice along with it. I don't believe he thinks of it as fraud exactly. I believe he thinks of it the way our father did, as simply how the business has always worked, a tradition as old as the vineyards themselves, no different from any other house's trade secrets. Is it illegal? I asked her. Some of it, almost certainly, under the appellation rules that govern labeling, she said. Some of it lives in a space clever enough to be difficult to prosecute, but illegal was never really the question I most needed answered. The question I needed answered was whether anyone, still working inside that house, was willing to look at it honestly, instead of translating it into something more comfortable, the way I imagine you once did, and the way I once did myself. Etienne, when Camille and I told him what Delphine had shared, went very quiet for a long time. I need to see the documents, he finally said. Not because I don't believe you, because if this is real, and if it's still happening, I need to understand exactly what I'm about to inherit before I decide what to do about it. He called me again a few days later, before the trip to Lyon, in a quieter, more private conversation than the one he'd have with Delphine directly. My grandfather used to take me through the vineyard rows when I was a boy, he told me. He'd tell me the name of every parcel, the history of every slope, like it was scripture. I grew up believing that reverence was the whole point of the family, that we were simply caretakers of something older and more honest than ourselves. I don't know how to hold that memory next to what you're describing. I don't know if I'm allowed to still love him, now that I know this. I think you're allowed to hold both, I told him. I loved parts of my time in that house too, Etienne. Your grandfather was warm to me in ways that had nothing to do with the ledgers. That doesn't erase what was in the ledgers. It just means he was a more complicated man than either the version you grew up with, or the version this makes him look like now. Most people are. He was quiet for a long moment on the line. I think that's the part I'm actually grieving, he said finally. Not the fraud itself. The fact that the man I loved and the man who built this were the same person, and I don't get to keep only the parts that felt good. He flew back to France a second time. This time with Camille beside him, a trip Camille insisted on making despite my worry that she was walking directly back into the family that had dismissed her at our own dinner table. I'm not going to sit here and let you and Etienne handle this without me, she told me, with a firmness that reminded me, with a small ache, of exactly how I'd raised her to be. If I'm going to marry into this family, I want to see clearly what I'm marrying into, all of it. Before they left for Lyon, Camille called her closest friend from college, a woman named Priya, who had talked her through every serious relationship she'd had since she was 19. She told me about the call afterward, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold. Priya asked me if I was sure I still wanted to marry him, Camille said. I told her I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. Not because his parents turned out to be decent people, they clearly aren't, not entirely, but because of exactly how he responded the second he found out the truth. He didn't defend them. He didn't ask me to let it go quietly for the sake of the family name. He got on a plane. I told her I thought that was exactly the right thing to have paid attention to. Anyone can say the right things when nothing's actually being tested, I said. It's what people do in the first 40 to 8 hours after finding out something ugly about their own family that tells you who they really are. I learned something else, in a smaller, quieter way, during those 2 weeks. Something about Solange I hadn't expected to learn, and wasn't entirely sure what to do with, once I had it. Etienne mentioned, almost in passing during one of our late-night conversations, that his mother hadn't been born into money at all. She'd grown up the daughter of a school teacher in a small town outside Lyon, had met Henri at university and had spent the first several years of their marriage, by his account, being quietly reminded by Henri's own mother, the grandmother I never met, that she'd married considerably above her station and would do well to remember it. I didn't excuse what Solange had said about Camille. I don't think anything excuses it. But I found myself thinking, uncomfortably, about the particular cruelty of a woman repeating, almost word for word, the exact condescension that had once been aimed at her. As though the only way she'd ever learned to survive inside that family was to make absolutely certain someone else occupied the lowest rung instead of her. They met with Delphine in Lyon rather than Reims at her insistence, away from any chance of Henri or Solange discovering the meeting before Etienne was ready for them to. Delphine laid out 15 years of carefully preserved documents across a kitchen table not unlike my own, export invoices that didn't match the appellation labels attached to them, internal memos discussing blending ratios in language. Careful enough to avoid ever using a word that might trigger regulatory attention. A paper trail of a business quietly, consistently cutting corners for decades, while trading on a reputation built entirely on the promise that it never would. Delphine told them, over the course of that long afternoon, the fuller version of her own story, pieces Etienne hadn't heard even as her nephew. She'd studied finance specifically because she loved the precision of it, the way numbers either balanced or they didn't, with no room for the kind of comfortable ambiguity the rest of the family business seemed to run on. She'd joined the family firm at 24, full of genuine enthusiasm, expecting to modernize record-keeping practices that had, in her words, clearly been designed by someone who assumed no one would ever look closely. She walked Etienne and Camille through specific examples that afternoon, laying out one particular ledger from the mid-2000s that recorded a shipment labeled as coming entirely from a prestigious single vineyard parcel, cross-referenced against a delivery manifest showing nearly 40% of the volume arriving from a bulk supplier 3 regions away. This one, she said, tapping the page, went to a distributor in Belgium who paid a premium specifically for that single vineyard designation. He never knew the difference, because there was never any reason for him to look as closely as I did. She'd kept nearly 24 such examples over the years, she told them, more than enough, on their own, to establish a clear and sustained pattern rather than an isolated lapse. The discrepancies she found weren't hidden particularly well, she told them. Not because whoever created them was careless, but because no one inside the family had ever seriously expected another family member to look at the books with real scrutiny. She brought her findings to her father first, expecting concern, or, at minimum, curiosity. Instead, she got a long, patient lecture about how the business had always worked, delivered in the same tone one might use to explain an old family recipe to someone who'd suggested changing an ingredient. I pushed twice more after that, Delphine said, each time more firmly. The third time my father simply stopped including me in finance meetings altogether. Within 6 months, I was offered a generous settlement to leave the company entirely, with language in the agreement specifically prohibiting me from discussing internal financial matters with anyone outside the family. I signed it. I was 26, unmarried, with no other income, and my own father made it very clear that fighting it would cost me every relationship I had left in that family. Etienne called me from Lyon that night, his voice hoarse in a way that told me he'd probably been fighting back tears for most of the day. "It's real," he said. "All of it. Worse than what you described, if anything. It's more systematic now than it was when you worked there. My father's built an entire export strategy around exactly the loophole Aunt Delphine found." "What do you want to do?" I asked him. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know I'm not spending the rest of my life pretending I don't." The confrontation with Henri happened 2 weeks later, back in Reims, in the same house I had once worked inside of as a 22-year-old translator too frightened to say what I actually saw. Etienne asked me to be there, over the phone, in a request that surprised me. "You're the reason any of this came to light," he said. "I think you've earned the right to be in the room when I tell my father what I know." I flew to France for the first time in 19 years on a Tuesday in October. Daniel beside me holding my hand somewhere over the Atlantic, in the particular quiet way he has of supporting me, without needing to fully understand what I'm walking back into. Camille met us at the airport, having flown in a day earlier with Etienne, both of them looking exhausted in a way that had less to do with jet lag than with the weight of the 2 weeks behind them. I flew to France for the first time in 19 years on a Tuesday in October. Daniel beside me holding my hand somewhere over the Atlantic in the particular quiet way he has of supporting me without needing to fully understand what I'm walking back into. Camille met us at the airport, having flown in a day earlier with Etienne, both of them looking exhausted in a way that had less to do with jet lag than with the weight of the 2 weeks behind them. The drive from the airport to Reims took just under 2 hours, and I spent most of it staring out the window at a landscape that hadn't changed at all in 19 years. Rows of vines rolling past in the particular tidy geometry that had once felt, to a 22-year-old translator, like the most sophisticated place on earth. It felt smaller now somehow, the way places from your 20s always do when you finally see them again as someone considerably less easy to impress. Daniel asked me, somewhere past Epernay, if I was all right. I told him honestly that I wasn't entirely sure yet. That some part of me had spent the whole flight rehearsing a version of myself who wouldn't feel 22 again the moment we passed through that gate, and that I wasn't confident yet whether it had worked. The house looked exactly as I remembered it. The same stone gatehouse, the same iron gate with the Rousseau crest, the same long gravel drive lined with vines that had likely been there since before my grandmother was born. Walking through that gate again, at 41 instead of 22, felt like meeting an old ghost of myself I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. Henri met us in his study, a room I remembered vividly from 2 decades earlier, though the furniture had changed. Solange wasn't present. Etienne had specifically asked that this conversation happen between the two men, with Camille, Delphine and me present as witnesses, and Solange, apparently, hadn't wanted any part of it. Etienne laid the documents Delphine had gathered on his father's own desk, one by one, without raising his voice. "I've seen the export invoices," he said. "I've seen the internal memos about blending ratios. I've spoken with Aunt Delphine about exactly what happened to her 15 years ago when she raised the same questions, and I've heard, directly from Maggie, what she translated for grandfather 20 years ago, before any of us were paying attention." Henri's face had gone the particular gray color of a man watching his entire life's architecture crumble in real time. "Etienne, you don't understand the wine business the way—" "I understand fraud," Etienne said, "in any business. I understand it well enough now to know that our family has been trading on a reputation we haven't actually earned for at least 20 years, possibly longer, and that you exiled your own sister for having the courage to say so." Henri looked, for a long moment, at each of us in turn. His son, his sister, his son's future mother-in-law, all three of us standing in a study he'd likely assumed, until that morning, would remain entirely his to control. "What do you intend to do with this?" he asked finally, his English formal and careful in the way it always was under strain, "beyond confronting me with it in my own house?" "I don't know yet," Etienne admitted. "I know I want an independent accounting, done properly, by someone with no reason to protect this family's name. Beyond that, I genuinely don't know. I came here today because I needed you to know that I know, before I decide anything else. I wasn't going to let you find out secondhand, through a lawyer, months from now." There was something almost merciful in that, I thought, watching Henri absorb it, Etienne giving his father the dignity of hearing it directly, in his own study, rather than through some colder legal channel. I don't know if Henri recognized the mercy in it at the time. I suspect he was too consumed by his own unraveling to notice much of anything beyond the desk in front of him. Henri didn't deny it, in the end. I think, looking back, some part of him had been waiting for a long time for someone in the family to finally force the conversation he'd never had the courage to start himself. He sat down heavily in his chair, and for the first time since I'd met him, looked less like a man performing composure, and more like a man simply tired of holding it up. "Your grandfather started it," he said quietly, "long before I was old enough to have any say in it. By the time I inherited the business, it wasn't a decision anymore. It was simply how things were done. I told myself, the way I imagine everyone tells themselves eventually, that stopping it would destroy 3 generations of work, that the wine itself was still good even if the labeling wasn't strictly honest, that no one was actually being harmed." "Delphine was harmed," Etienne said. "She lost her career, and 15 years of her life to keep this quiet." Henri didn't have an answer for that. Delphine, standing near the window, didn't offer him one either. "What happens now?" Henri finally asked, looking not at his son but at me. as though some part of him understood that I was the one who'd set this entire chain of events into motion at a dinner table 3,000 miles away. "That's not my decision to make," I told him. "It never was. I only ever intended to defend my daughter at her own engagement dinner. What you do with the business you've inherited, and the truth your son now knows about it, is between the three of you." Before we left the estate that day, I asked, almost on impulse, whether old Faucher was still alive. Henri told me, somewhat surprised by the question, that he'd retired over a decade earlier, but still lived in the village, in a small house near the church. I found his address through the local mairie and drove there myself the next morning, before our flight home, unannounced, the way I hadn't planned to do anything on this trip. He recognized me instantly, despite the 19 years, and despite my hair having gone considerably grayer than it had been at 22. "Mademoiselle Chastain," he said in French, standing in his doorway with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I wondered sometimes, what became of you?" News of the investigation, once it reached the wine trade press, traveled through the small village around Maison Rousseau far faster and far more thoroughly than any of us had anticipated. Faucher told me, during that same visit, that the local bakery had become something of an unofficial clearinghouse for opinion on the matter, divided roughly between those who felt the family had finally gotten what generations of quiet arrogance deserved, and those who worried more practically about what a diminished Maison Rousseau might mean for the dozens of smaller growers in the region, who supplied its legitimate parcels and depended on its reputation to command fair prices for their own grapes. "It is not so simple as villains and victims in a village like this one," Faucher told me. "Half the families here have worked those vineyards for generations, under contracts with the Rousseaus that long predate any of this scandal. They did not do anything wrong, they simply grew grapes and trusted the name attached to the label. I think, in the end, that is the part of this story people here will remember longest, not what Henri Rousseau did, but what it cost the people who had nothing to do with it, and everything to lose from it." I told him what I knew about Etienne's decision to voluntarily disclose everything to the Appellation Authority, rather than let it surface through some more damaging channel later. Faucher considered this for a long moment. "That, at least, was the right choice," he said. "A slow, deliberate reckoning, chosen honestly, does less damage to the growers than a scandal that arrives all at once, forced into the open by someone with no stake in softening the landing. Perhaps that is the one mercy in how young Etienne chose to handle it." He walked me to my car when I finally left, moving slower than I remembered, leaning slightly on a cane he hadn't needed 19 years earlier. At the gate he paused and looked at me directly. "You could have simply enjoyed your daughter's happiness and said nothing, mademoiselle. Many people would have. I want you to know that I understand the cost of what you chose instead, better than most people ever could." He didn't say anything further after that, simply nodded once, the same careful, economical gesture I remembered from every negotiation I'd once translated for him, and turned back toward his door. I told him briefly what had happened. The dinner, the ledgers finally surfacing, Etienne's decision to bring in an independent auditor. Faucher listened without much visible surprise, the way a man listens to news he's been quietly expecting for a very long time. "I told you once to choose which job you actually had," he said when I finished. "I've thought about that conversation more than you might imagine over the years. I chose the same job you did, mademoiselle. I stayed 30 more years after you left, translating figures into numbers more comfortable than the truth. I told myself it was loyalty. I'm not certain now that it was anything more than fear." "Do you regret it?" I asked him. He considered the question for a long moment. "I regret that it took someone else's daughter, at someone else's dinner table, 30 years later, to finally say what I never had the courage to." He paused. "But I don't regret that it was finally said. Perhaps that's the best any of us can hope for, at the end of something like this. Not that we were brave enough ourselves, but that we didn't stand in the way of someone who was." It took Etienne another 6 weeks to decide what he actually wanted to do, weeks that stretched Camille thin with worry, in a way I recognized from my own younger years, the particular strain of loving someone who is quietly rebuilding their understanding of their own family from the ground up. He didn't destroy the business. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story people expect to end with headlines and scandal, and a family publicly ruined, And that isn't what happened. Not exactly. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways harder. Etienne hired his own independent auditor, a woman recommended by a former professor from his enology studies. Someone with no ties to the family and no reason to look away from anything she found. Her name was Inez Beaumont, and she'd built her career specifically auditing winehouses suspected of exactly this kind of labeling irregularity. Work that had made her, by reputation, both respected and quietly unwelcome in certain corners of the industry. She spent nearly 2 months going through 15 years of export records, cross-referencing them against appellation requirements, growing patterns, and shipping manifests, working out of a small rented office in Reims that Etienne insisted on paying for personally, rather than through the family business, so that no one could later claim the audit itself had been compromised. Inez worked methodically, according to Etienne, cross-checking every discrepancy Delphine had flagged against the original grower's records, some of which required her to travel personally to smaller vineyard operations 2 and 3 hours outside Reims to verify harvest volumes that hadn't been digitized. She insisted, at Etienne's own suggestion, on interviewing several long-time employees of the business directly, including 2 retired workers from the bottling floor, who confirmed, independently of each other and without knowing what the other had said, a long-standing informal practice of supplementing certain lots before final labeling, described to them at the time as a routine part of maintaining consistent flavor profiles across vintages, rather than anything more troubling. Inez called Etienne twice during those 2 months, with preliminary findings, each call apparently worse than the last. The final report ran to nearly 90 pages, and Etienne told me, when he finally read it in full, that he'd had to stop twice and walk outside, unable to keep reading in one sitting. It's not just what Delphine found, he told me. It's the scale of it. It's not one bad year, or one desperate decision under financial pressure. It's a system built deliberately, refined over 20 years, designed specifically to stay just under the threshold that would trigger real scrutiny from the appellation authority. My father didn't inherit a flaw, Maggie. He inherited a machine, and he kept it running exactly the way it was built to run. He gave his own independent auditor full access to 15 years of export records, and told her plainly that he wanted the truth documented properly, regardless of what it cost the family name. The audit confirmed what Delphine's documents had already shown. Etienne, rather than report the findings anonymously, or bury them in a lawsuit that would take years, and likely destroy the business, along with his father's reputation, chose instead to bring the matter directly to the Regional Appellation Authority himself, voluntarily, with his own name attached to the disclosure. I'd rather we be the ones who corrected this, he told me, the week before he made the report, than spend the rest of my career hoping no one else ever finds it first. The consequences were significant but survivable. A formal reprimand, a multi-year probationary period on certain export certifications, a substantial fine, and a public statement, drafted with legal counsel, acknowledging historical inconsistencies in labeling practices predating current leadership. Language careful enough to protect the business's survival while still constituting, in every way that mattered, an admission. The fine itself came to just under 420,000 euros, a figure Etienne told me had taken the family's accountants nearly 3 weeks to properly calculate against the specific volume of misrepresented lots identified in Inez Beaumont's audit. On top of that, the house voluntarily set aside an additional sum, close to 200,000 euros by Etienne's account, as a restitution fund for identified importers going back a full decade, Robert Kessler Jr.'s restitution among the first payments made from it. It wasn't the kind of number that bankrupted a business with 3 centuries of accumulated land and reputation behind it, but it was, Etienne assured me. More than once, enough to actually hurt, which I think matters more than people realize. An apology that costs nothing isn't really an apology at all. The Regional Appellation Authority's investigation took the better part of a year to formally conclude, longer than any of us expected, dragging through a series of hearings that required Etienne to travel to their offices in Epernay no fewer than 6 times. He told me, after the 3rd hearing, that the process had a strange, grinding quality to it. Nothing dramatic happening in any single meeting, just careful, patient officials working methodically through 15 years of documents, while he sat across the table, representing a family name he was actively trying to hold accountable, rather than defend. He described one hearing in particular, the 4th, where the panel's lead investigator, a precise, unhurried woman named Madame Girard, spent nearly 2 hours walking through a single year of export records line by line, asking Etienne to explain discrepancies in shipments he hadn't even been born for yet. At one point, he told me, she looked up from the paperwork and asked me directly why I'd chosen to bring this forward myself, rather than wait for someone else to find it. I told her the truth, that I didn't want my children, if I ever have them, to inherit a business built on something I'd known about, and chosen to protect, instead of correct. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she simply nodded, and moved on to the next set of records. Inez Beaumont, the independent auditor, testified at 2 of the 6 hearings, laying out her findings with the same clinical precision she'd used in her original 90-page report. Etienne told me she'd been asked more than once by the panel whether she believed the current generation of leadership, meaning Etienne himself, bore direct responsibility for practices that had clearly predated his taking over the business. Her answer, each time, was the same, that the fraud had been inherited, but that the decision to expose it, fully and voluntarily, had been entirely his own, and that this distinction mattered as much to the panel's ultimate findings as the fraud itself. "There's a particular kind of loneliness to it," he told me once, over the phone. "I'm the one bringing them the evidence against my own family. I don't get to be angry in the room the way I feel angry everywhere else. I just have to sit there, calm and cooperative, while they decide exactly how much this costs us." Word of the investigation eventually reached the wine trade press. In the careful, understated way these things tend to surface. A single paragraph in an industry newsletter, followed by a slightly longer piece in a regional French wine publication, followed eventually by a brief mention in an American trade magazine that Camille's own industry contacts flagged for her within hours of publication. None of the coverage named specific individuals beyond Maison Rousseau itself, and none of it, to Etienne's evident relief, mentioned Delphine by name, or connected the investigation publicly to any single family member's testimony. I thought, more than once during that year, of Robert Kessler, the American importer, whose enthusiasm I'd once translated so carefully into something he could properly appreciate. I wondered whether he was still in business, whether he'd ever learned what portion of what he'd sold under Maison Rousseau's name over the years hadn't been entirely what the label claimed. Etienne, when I finally asked him about it, told me he'd looked into it himself, out of a sense of obligation he couldn't quite explain. Kessler had retired 8 years earlier, and sold his importing business. His son now ran it under a different name, still carrying several Maison Rousseau lines. Etienne reached out personally, disclosed what the audit had found regarding shipments from the years Kessler Sr. would have received, and offered a formal accounting and partial restitution for the specific lots involved, entirely unprompted by any regulatory requirement to do so. His son didn't have to say yes to hearing any of it, Etienne told me. He could have just kept selling the wine and never asked a single question. He didn't. He asked for the full accounting, took the restitution, and told me he respected that I'd been the one to call, rather than wait for someone else to find it. Etienne paused. It didn't undo what I translated for his father 20 years ago, at your table, without either of us fully understanding what we were doing in that moment, but it felt like the closest thing to making it right that was actually available to us. Henri stepped back from day-to-day operations within the year, officially citing his age, unofficially understood by everyone in the family to be a quiet, face-saving retreat from a business he could no longer run under the same terms he'd inherited it. Etienne took over fully, with Delphine, invited back into the company for the first time in 15 years, serving as an independent advisor on compliance, a role I suspect gave her more satisfaction than any of us fully appreciated. I spoke with Henri once more before we left Reims that final week of the investigation's early stages, a brief, unplanned conversation in the estate's courtyard, while Etienne and Camille finished packing the car. He looked older than he had even at the engagement dinner 8 months earlier, the particular older that comes not from time passing but from a man watching the version of himself he'd spent decades constructing come apart in full view of his own family. "I imagine you feel some satisfaction in this," he said, not unkindly, more curious than accusatory. "No," I told him honestly. "I don't feel satisfaction. I feel relief mostly that my daughter isn't marrying into a lie she doesn't understand. Whatever happens to you and your business is genuinely secondary to that, Henri. I was never trying to punish you. I was trying to protect her." He nodded slowly, looking out over the vine rows the way I remembered his father doing on our long walk with Kessler 2 decades earlier. My father used to tell me, he said, that this land remembers everything, even when the people who work it choose to forget. I always thought that was simply something vintners say to sound poetic. I wonder now if he meant it as a warning he never quite had the courage to explain properly. I didn't have a response for that, and I don't think he was expecting one. We stood there for a moment longer, two people who had once, in very different rooms, chosen to translate an uncomfortable truth into something easier to live with, before finally walking back toward the house without another word between us. Solange never apologized to Camille directly, not in any way that felt like more than damage control. She sent a card, eventually, weeks after the dinner, formal and carefully worded, expressing regret for any misunderstanding that had occurred. Language so bloodless that Camille read it once, folded it back into its envelope, and didn't mention it again. I don't need her to mean it, Camille told me. I just needed everyone in that family to know that I heard exactly what she said, and that I'm not spending the rest of my life pretending I didn't. I did have one direct conversation with Solange myself, unplanned, during our second trip to France that spring, when Camille and Etienne were finalizing wedding logistics with a venue coordinator, and I found myself alone with her in the estate's garden for perhaps 20 minutes. I hadn't sought the conversation out. She approached me, somewhat stiffly, near a row of rose bushes, and asked, without much preamble, whether I intended to continue holding the dinner against her. I don't think I'm holding anything against you that you didn't say yourself, in front of my daughter, at her own engagement dinner, I told her. She was quiet for a moment, turning a rose stem between her fingers, in a way that suggested she was choosing her next words with unusual care. You have to understand, she said finally, the world I married into. I was told for years that I would never truly belong to it, no matter how well I learned to perform. Belonging. I suppose some part of me decided, a long time ago, that I would rather be the one. Deciding who else didn't belong than continue being reminded that I didn't, myself. She went on, after a moment, describing a specific memory from her own early marriage. A dinner, decades earlier, at which Henri's own mother had corrected the way she held her wineglass in front of a room full of relatives. A small, precise humiliation she said she'd carried for years afterward, without ever once naming it as cruelty. I told myself for a long time that I had simply misunderstood her intentions, Solange said. It took me most of my life to admit that I hadn't misunderstood anything at all. I had simply learned, the way one learns most things in families like this one, that surviving it meant eventually finding someone smaller to aim it at instead. That doesn't make it acceptable, I said. It might make it understandable. Those aren't the same thing. No, she agreed. I don't suppose they are. She didn't apologize in that conversation, not directly, not in any language I could carry back to my daughter as evidence of genuine remorse. But something in her posture shifted, slightly, in a way I recognized. The particular exhaustion of a woman finally saying a true thing out loud after holding a performance together for a very long time. I didn't tell Camille the specifics of that conversation for months afterward, uncertain what it would mean to her, or whether it would mean anything at all. Henri, to his credit, made a more genuine attempt. He wrote Camille a long letter, in English this time, apologizing specifically for the words he'd used at our dinner table, acknowledging that they'd reflected a prejudice about American marriages, and about Camille specifically, that he recognized now as both cruel and entirely unearned. He didn't try to explain it away as a language barrier or a misunderstanding, the way he had that first night. He simply owned it. The letter, Camille told me, ran nearly 3 pages, and included a passage she read aloud to me only once, months later, her voice unsteady on certain lines. I have spent my life believing that protecting this family meant protecting its name above all else, Henri had written, and I see now that I mistook silence for protection far too many times, at far too great a cost to people who deserved better from me, my sister first, and now nearly you as well. I cannot undo what I said at your table. I can only tell you that I intend to spend whatever years I have left proving it was not the truest thing I know about you. Only the ugliest thing I ever said. Camille kept that letter. She told me once that she thought it mattered less for what it changed between her and Henri, and more as proof to herself that she hadn't imagined the whole ugly shape of that first dinner. That someone in the family had finally been willing to say, plainly, that it had happened, and it had been wrong. At the 1-year mark from that dinner, almost to the day, Camille and I sat on my back porch with a bottle of wine that had nothing to do with France at all. A modest bottle from a vineyard 2 counties over that Camille had picked up on a whim from a farm stand. We toasted, half joking, to surviving the worst engagement dinner in recorded history. And then sat in a comfortable silence for a long while, watching the light go gold over the yard the way it does in early autumn. "Do you ever wish you'd told me sooner?" she asked. "About Reims, about all of it." "Every day for the first few months," I admitted. "Now I think I told you exactly when I was ready to. Which happened to be at the worst possible moment, in front of the worst possible audience, which is usually how these things actually work. Nobody plans the moment they finally stop being quiet. It just arrives. And you either take it or you don't." "I'm glad you took it," she said. "So am I told her. "Though I could have done without your fork clattering quite so loudly against the plate." She laughed, properly, for the first time in a while when the subject of that dinner came up, and I understood, watching her, that whatever residual weight the whole ordeal still carried for either of us had finally started to lighten into something we could talk about, and even laugh about, rather than something either of us needed to carefully step around. The morning of the wedding, I found Camille in the small farmhouse room set aside for the bridal party, Priya beside her doing something complicated with a curling iron while Camille sat perfectly still, staring at her own reflection with an expression somewhere between joy and disbelief that the day had actually arrived, after everything that had led up to it. "You look exactly like your grandmother did on her wedding day," I told her, which was true, and which made her eyes fill immediately, prompting Priya to swat at both of us with the curling iron for threatening the makeup schedule. Priya, adjusting the last pin in Camille's hair, caught my eye in the mirror and said, quietly enough that it felt like it was meant just for me, "For what it's worth, I've watched this whole thing from the outside for a year now, and I think you did exactly the right thing that night." I don't think Camille would say it quite this way, but I think some part of her needed to see you do that, needed to know her own mother would stand up like that for her, before she could fully trust that she'd chosen a man who'd do the same. Priya had known Camille since their freshman year of college, long enough to have watched her navigate 2 previous serious relationships before Etienne, and long enough, she told me later that same afternoon, to recognize something genuinely different in how Camille carried herself throughout this particular ordeal. "She's never fought this hard to understand someone else's family before," Priya said. "Usually it's easier to just walk away when things get complicated. I think the fact that she didn't, this time, tells you everything you need to know about what she actually believes she's building with him." I didn't have a ready response for that. Standing in a small farmhouse room smelling of hairspray and cut flowers, watching my daughter get ready to marry a man whose family I'd once quietly, carefully chosen not to examine too closely. I simply thanked her, and went to go find Daniel, who was pacing near the barn in his rented suit, looking more nervous than I'd seen him since Camille's own birth. The wedding itself took place the following June, in a small vineyard outside Albany rather than the grand estate in Reims that had originally been discussed. Camille wanted it that way, deliberately, on ground that belonged to her own family story, rather than the Rousseau family's history. The vineyard she chose was a modest one, family-run, nothing like the centuries of Polish behind Maison Rousseau, and I think that was precisely the point. String lights hung between rows of vines far younger than anything in Reims, and Camille walked down a grass aisle in the early evening light, looking, I thought, exactly like a woman who had spent the past year learning precisely what she would and wouldn't accept from the family she was marrying into, and had come out the other side of it more certain of herself, not less. Etienne had offered, more than once during the planning process, to hold the wedding in Reims instead, on his family's own land, insisting it would mean a great deal to his grandmother's memory, and to the older relatives who couldn't easily travel. Camille turned him down gently, but firmly each time. "I love that you want to honor your family's history," she told him, during one of these conversations, which she later recounted to me, almost word for word, "but I need our wedding to start on ground that's never once made me feel like I needed to earn my place at the table. I need it to start here, where I already know exactly who I am." Wedding dress shopping happened that spring, months before any of the venue details were settled, on an afternoon that turned out to matter more than either of us expected going in. Camille had tried on nearly a dozen dresses, without finding one that felt right. Growing quietly frustrated, in the particular way brides do, when the whole process starts to feel like a referendum on something bigger than fabric. In the dressing room between appointments, she asked me, out of nowhere, whether I thought she was making a mistake. Not the dress, she clarified, when I looked confused. The marriage. Do you think I'm making a mistake? I thought carefully before answering, because I didn't want to give her a reflexive reassurance, just because it was what a mother is supposed to say in a dressing room. I think, I told her, that a year ago, you were about to marry a family without knowing anything true about them. Now you know exactly what they're capable of at their worst, and you're choosing to marry their son anyway, with your eyes fully open, because of what he did in the worst 48 hours of it. That's not a mistake, Cam. That's about as informed a decision as any bride gets to make. She found her dress 20 minutes later, in the very next appointment, and cried when she looked in the mirror, though I couldn't tell you whether it was about the dress or the conversation before it. The rehearsal dinner, held 2 nights before the wedding at a small restaurant Daniel and I had celebrated our own anniversary at more than once, included both families for the first time since the disastrous engagement dinner nearly a year earlier. It was, by design, a much smaller and more careful gathering. No long formal courses, no easy opportunity for anyone to slip into a private aside in a language they assumed no one else could follow. Henri gave a brief toast in careful, deliberate English, thanking Camille specifically for her patience with a family that did not always deserve it, language that struck me as the closest thing to a public accounting he was capable of offering. Solange said very little the entire evening, though she did at one point compliment Camille's dress for the rehearsal, in a tone that sounded, for the first time I'd heard from her, entirely without an edge attached. Henri and Solange attended the wedding itself. So did Delphine, who Camille specifically asked to be seated at the family table, a small, deliberate gesture that meant more to Delphine, I think, than anyone at the reception fully understood. I watched Delphine during the ceremony, dabbing carefully at her eyes with a handkerchief, and understood, without needing to ask, that some part of what she was crying about had very little to do with the 2 people getting married, and a great deal to do with finally being welcomed back to a family table she'd been quietly excluded from for 15 years. Among the guests, at Etienne's specific invitation, was a man named Robert Kessler Jr., the son of the American importer I'd once translated for on that walk through the vineyard rows 20 years earlier. He'd flown in specifically, at his own expense, after Etienne's earlier call about the restitution, and introduced himself to me at the cocktail hour with a warmth I hadn't expected. My father passed 2 years ago, he told me, and I never got to tell him what your future son-in-law found in those old records. I think he would have wanted to know the truth, even that late. I think he would have respected a young man willing to call and say it out loud, instead of letting it stay buried. Do you still carry the Maison Rousseau lines? I asked him, genuinely curious. A few, he said. Different ones now, verified against the new label standards before we agreed to keep any of it. My father built that importing business on the belief that a handshake and a good story meant something. I spent a long time afterward wondering whether that belief had simply made him easy to fool. Talking with Etienne this year, I've started to think it was never his belief that was the problem. It was simply that a few people around him decided his trust was something to exploit, rather than earn, honestly. That's a different lesson than the one I'd been carrying around. I didn't know quite what to say to that, standing in a vineyard 3,000 miles from where any of it started, so I simply thanked him for coming, and meant it more than the sentence probably conveyed. Daniel gave a toast of his own that evening, brief and characteristically understated, mostly about how he'd learned more about his own wife of 20 years in the past 12 months than in the 2 decades before it, which got the biggest laugh of the night and also, I noticed, the warmest look Camille gave either of us all evening. I don't speak a word of French, he said, raising his glass. But I've learned this year that the language doesn't matter nearly as much as being willing to say the hard thing out loud, in whatever words you've got. To Camille and Etienne, may you always choose to say the hard thing. Daniel danced with Camille later that evening, the traditional father-daughter dance the wedding planner had scheduled for just after dinner, to a song Camille had chosen years earlier, long before any of this had happened. back when she'd first started imagining her own wedding as a teenager. I watched them from our table, Daniel visibly emotional in the understated way he allows himself to be maybe twice a year, and thought about how much had changed since the last time father and daughter had stood that close together at a family gathering, the engagement dinner, where he'd sat frozen at the far end of the table, uncertain how to respond to what was unfolding in a language he couldn't follow. "You did good, Dad," I heard Camille tell him quietly, as the song ended, loud enough that I caught it from 3 tables away. "Both of you did." Etienne's toast that evening spent more time discussing what he'd learned about honesty in the past year than about romance, which struck exactly the right note for a wedding that had been built, in its own strange way, on the ruins of a lie finally being named out loud. He thanked his aunt, by name, for her courage. He thanked me, more briefly, for refusing to stay quiet at a dinner table that wasn't even mine to defend. He didn't thank his parents in any specific way, beyond a general nod to everyone who traveled far to be here, and I noticed Henri's jaw tighten slightly at the omission, though he said nothing about it. Camille gave her own toast later in the evening, something the wedding planner had mentioned was unusual, but which Camille had insisted on from the very beginning. She spoke about the year that had passed since the engagement dinner without naming any specifics of what had happened, careful, I think, not to turn her own wedding reception into a public accounting of anyone else's family's failures. But she looked directly at me for the last part of it. "My mother taught me French phrases when I was small that I never once needed until this year," she said. "She taught me, more importantly, that understanding something and choosing when to say so out loud are 2 very different kinds of strength, and that you don't owe anyone the second one until you're ready to use it." I watched her use both this year, in defense of me, and I don't think I've ever been prouder to be her daughter than I was at that dinner table. Later, during the reception's quieter final hour, I watched Solange approach Camille near the dessert table, the 2 of them exchanging a brief, careful conversation I couldn't hear from where I stood. Camille told me about it afterward, in the car on the way to their hotel that night. Solange had simply said, "You handled yourself with more grace at that dinner than I did in 30 years of that family. I wanted you to know I noticed, even if I never said it properly at the time." Camille hadn't offered forgiveness in return, not exactly, but she'd thanked her, and the 2 of them had stood together for a moment longer than either strictly needed to, in the particular quiet way people signal a wary truce without needing to name it as one. I gave a short toast of my own, and found myself, halfway through it, slipping briefly into French, for no reason beyond the fact that it no longer felt like a drawer I needed to keep shut. Henri, from across the room, met my eyes for just a moment, and nodded, once, in a way that felt less like forgiveness and more like acknowledgement. One small, honest gesture between 2 people who had once, in very different ways, chosen to translate a truth rather than say it plainly, and had both, eventually, chosen differently. There is one more conversation from that year I haven't yet described, one that happened privately between Camille and Henri, months before the wedding, that Camille only told me about afterward, in full, once enough time had passed that she could talk about it without her voice shaking. Henri had asked to speak with her alone, during their family's 3rd visit to the United States that year. A request that surprised her enough that she agreed mostly out of curiosity about what he might say. They sat in our backyard, on the same patio furniture Daniel had built himself the summer before Camille left for college, and Henri, for the first time since the engagement dinner, spoke without any trace of the practiced diplomacy she'd come to expect from him. "I want you to understand something," he told her, "that I am not certain I fully understand myself even now. I did not marry Solange for love, not entirely, not at first. My own father arranged the introduction with considerable care, the way arrangements were still made in families like ours at the time, and I convinced myself, over years, that what grew between us was love, because it was easier than admitting I had accepted a partnership dressed up as a marriage. When I looked at you, at that dinner, I think some part of me saw a woman entering a marriage on entirely different terms than the ones I understood, terms built on genuine affection, rather than suitability. And I did not know how to make sense of it except to assume it must be naive, or temporary, because, acknowledging that it might simply be real, would have meant acknowledging what I had settled for myself." Camille told me she hadn't expected an explanation that honest, and hadn't fully known what to do with it in the moment. "It didn't make what he said acceptable," she told me, But it made it make a kind of sense I hadn't had before. He wasn't cruel to me because he thought I wasn't good enough for Etienne. He was cruel to me because some part of him has spent 30 years grieving a version of love he never let himself have, and watching us have it in front of him was more than he knew how to sit with gracefully. "Do you forgive him?" I asked her. She thought about it for a long moment. "I think I understand him," she said finally. "I'm not sure those are the same thing yet. But I think understanding is where forgiveness, if it ever comes, would have to start." I think now about that dinner often. Not the moment of the slap of silence when I set down my fork, though I've never once regretted it, but about the 19 years before it, when I let an old fluency and an old cowardice sit quietly in the same drawer, telling myself the door was better left closed. I think too about Delphine, who carried her own version of that same silence for 15 years, alone, until a stranger from her brother's past sat down at an American dinner table, and finally cracked the whole thing open. I think about Faucher, who chose the comfortable translation for 30 years longer than I did, and who told me, standing in his own doorway, that the best any of us can hope for is not to have been brave first, but to not stand in the way once someone else finally is. I think about Solange too, more than I expected to, given everything. I don't excuse what she said about my daughter. I don't think anything excuses it. But I've come to believe that cruelty like hers rarely originates in a vacuum. That somewhere behind nearly every woman who makes a point of reminding someone else of their place, there's an earlier version of herself, who was once made to feel exactly that small, and never fully recovered from the lesson. That understanding doesn't erase what she said. It simply means I've stopped needing her to be a simple villain, in order to feel at peace with how the story ended. I think about Robert Kessler too, the American importer whose trust I once helped translate into something more palatable than the truth, and about his son, standing at my daughter's wedding, telling me his father would have wanted to know, even 20 years too late. I think about how much of this entire story turned, in the end, not on grand revelations, but on a series of people, Delphine, Faucher, Kessler's son, even Henri himself eventually, finally choosing honesty over the comfortable alternative, one small, overdue decision at a time. I learned, in the end, that some inheritances aren't about money, or land, or a family name 3 centuries old. Some inheritances are simply about which truths get passed down, and which ones get quietly translated into something more comfortable, generation after generation, until someone at the table finally decides to stop. I don't know if Henri Rousseau would have ever told his son the truth about that business on his own. I don't know if Delphine would have ever found the courage to come forward, without a stranger from decades earlier sitting down at the same family's table again, 20 years and one language later, finally refusing to stay quiet. I don't know, honestly, whether I would have found that courage myself, at any other dinner, on any other night, if the words aimed at my daughter had been slightly less specific, slightly easier to let pass. I've thought too about whether Henri and Solange would have ever changed course on their own, given another decade, another generation, another chance to quietly correct themselves without a stranger forcing the issue at their own table. I suspect not. I suspect families like theirs rarely reform themselves from the inside without something external breaking the pattern first, an outsider's fluency, an auditor's spreadsheet, a son finally willing to call his own father's business exactly what it was. I don't say that with any particular pride in having been the one who did it. I say it only because I think it's true, and because I think it's worth remembering. For anyone who's ever sat quietly at a table wondering whether speaking up will actually change anything. Sometimes it takes exactly one person willing to say the thing out loud, and sometimes that person simply has to be you. What I know is that I spent 2 years of my life learning exactly how to translate a lie into something easier to swallow, and 19 years after that, learning to live with having done it. It took one dinner, one sentence about my daughter delivered in a language they assumed bought them privacy, to finally undo both. I think occasionally about how differently that evening might have gone, if I hadn't understood French at all, if I'd simply smiled along through those 2 hours the way Daniel had, catching nothing but tone and body language, sensing only vaguely that something felt off without ever having the words to name it. Camille would still have married into that family. She might never have learned, until far too late, exactly what kind of silence she was marrying into, alongside her husband. I think about that alternate version of events more than I probably should, given that it never actually happened. I think I return to it because it reminds me how much of what protected my daughter that year came down to a single stubborn decision my own father made decades earlier, to fill our house with language tapes, to insist that fluency was worth the effort, long before either of us had any idea what it might one day be used to defend. I think sometimes about what I'll tell my own grandchildren one day, if Camille and Etienne are lucky enough to have them, whether I'll teach them French the way my father taught me, filling some future house with tapes and a stubborn belief in fluency as freedom, and whether I'll tell them, when they're old enough to understand it, about the 2 years of my life I spent choosing not to say what I understood, and the one dinner, decades later, when I finally chose differently. Now that Camille is expecting, that question has stopped feeling hypothetical. I've already started, without quite meaning to, humming old French children's songs under my breath while I cook, songs I hadn't thought about in decades resurfacing from somewhere I'd assumed was long closed off. I mentioned this to Daniel one evening, half embarrassed by how much it seemed to matter to me, and he told me simply, "Then teach the baby. You spent 19 years treating that language like something you'd done wrong with it once. Maybe it's time it got to mean something good for a while." I've started collecting a small stack of children's books in French already, ordered quietly online over the past few months, tucked into a drawer in the guest room the way I once tucked away an entire chapter of my life in a very different kind of drawer. This one, I intend to open on purpose, the moment there's a small enough person around to make use of it. I think I will. I think it's the kind of inheritance worth passing down on purpose, rather than the kind that simply gets translated quietly from one generation to the next, until somebody stops it. I imagine, sometimes, a small kitchen years from now, a child at my knee learning to count in French the way I once did at my own father's. And I hope, when that child is finally old enough to ask why I sound so certain it matters, that I'll have the same honest answer my own father never quite got the chance to give me before that door closed for 19 years. That language is a place to stand when the room gets too small to hold what you need to say, and that the whole point of learning it is to use it, eventually, out loud. Camille and Etienne have been married 2 years now. Camille tells me, sometimes, that her mother-in-law has softened slightly, in ways that feel less like performance, and more like genuine adjustment. Small things. An unprompted phone call to ask about Camille's work rather than her plans for children. A birthday gift chosen with actual thought rather than obligation. I don't know if that softening is permanent. I've learned not to need it to be, in order to feel at peace with everything that happened. I think about how strange it is sometimes, that the family I once quietly decided not to examine too closely 20 years ago is now permanently woven into my own, through a grandchild who will grow up calling both Henri and Daniel grandfather, who will inherit, whether either family intends it or not, some blend of Rousseau formality and Chastain bluntness, some measure of old vineyard patience and newer American directness. I find myself hoping more than anything else, that whatever this child eventually learns about honesty, they learn it the way Etienne finally did. Not as an abstract virtue, but as something you choose, deliberately, even when the alternative would be so much easier to live with. They visited us this past Christmas, Etienne and Camille both, along with news that surprised all of us in the best possible way. Etienne had decided, after 2 years of running the business under the terms of its probationary compliance period, to launch a small, entirely separate label under his own name, sourced exclusively from parcels he'd personally verified against Appalachian records, marketed honestly, without any pretense to a centuries-old mystique it hadn't actually earned in every bottle. He named it, simply, Fauché, a gesture that apparently moved the old accountant to tears when Etienne called to ask his permission before announcing it publicly. "I wanted something that meant honesty," Etienne told us over dinner, named for the one person in that house who told the truth about what he was choosing, even if he chose wrong for 30 years afterward. I thought he deserved to have his name attached to something that finally chose differently. He described the label's first vintage in more detail than any of us, frankly, needed at a Christmas dinner table, but I understood the enthusiasm underneath it. Every bottle carried a small card, tucked beneath the foil, listing the exact parcel the grapes had come from, the exact date of harvest, and a short paragraph, in both French and English, explaining the label's founding principle, that a wine's story was only worth telling if every word of it was true. Fauché himself, well into his 80s now, had apparently insisted on tasting the first vintage before it was bottled, and had wept, according to Etienne, not because the wine was extraordinary, it was good, honest, unpretentious, but because it existed at all, built on the exact opposite of everything he'd spent 30 years helping to obscure. Delphine now sits on the label's small advisory board alongside her nephew, a role she describes, with the same dry precision I remember from our very first phone call, as considerably more honest work than I ever expected to find my way back to in this family. She visited us in New York last spring, her first trip to the United States, and spent an entire afternoon in my kitchen, asking careful, curious questions about my life. After Reims, the way, I think, she'd always wondered what became of the other people who'd once quietly noticed what she noticed, and chosen, at the time, to look away. She asked, at one point, whether I'd ever regretted staying quiet for as long as I had. I told her honestly that I had, more times than I could count, in the 19 years between leaving Reims and that dinner. But I've also come to think, I told her, that the regret itself was doing some quiet work the whole time, even when I wasn't looking at it directly. It kept the door slightly ajar, I think, instead of sealing it shut completely. When the moment finally came, some part of me was ready, because I'd never quite managed to convince myself it was fully over. Delphine nodded slowly at that, turning her coffee cup in her hands the way I remembered her turning a rose stem, months earlier, though that had been Solange, not her. The two women had, I realized, a similar habit of needing something small to hold on to, while working through a difficult thought out loud. I think my regret did the same work, she said finally. 15 years of it, quietly, refusing to fully close. I suppose that's its own kind of usefulness, even when it doesn't feel like anything but pain at the time. She stayed 3 more days after that conversation, long enough to attend one of Camille's client presentations out of genuine professional curiosity, and long enough for the two of them to develop, unexpectedly, a warm rapport built. Partly on shared interest in the wine industry's finer points, and partly, I suspect, on the particular bond of two women who'd each been dismissed once by the same family, in different ways, and had both, eventually, refused to stay dismissed. Camille's own career shifted in an unexpected direction over those 2 years as well. The story of the engagement dinner, in the careful, anonymized way these things travel through professional circles, eventually reached a colleague of hers who worked with a nonprofit focused on transparency in the wine and spirits import industry, and Camille found herself, almost by accident, consulting part-time on a project training smaller American importers to recognize exactly the kind of labeling irregularities that had once nearly slipped past Robert Kessler Sr. 2 decades earlier. I never expected the worst night of my life to turn into part of my actual career, she told me, laughing, at Christmas dinner. But I suppose if I'm going to carry this story around for the rest of my life anyway, I'd rather it be useful to someone. She told us at that same dinner, holding Etienne's hand across the table with an expression I hadn't seen on her since her own wedding day, that she was 3 months pregnant, the first grandchild for both families. Solange, seated across the table, cried, genuinely I think for the first time since I'd known her, and reached for Camille's other hand without being asked. It was a small gesture, and I don't know if it undid anything from that first terrible dinner. But watching the two of them sit there, hands joined across a table that had once held something so much uglier, I found myself thinking that perhaps this was simply what repair actually looks like in families as complicated as this one. Not a single dramatic reconciliation, but a long accumulation of smaller, quieter moments that slowly outweigh the worst one. I do know that my daughter walked into that marriage with her eyes fully open, understanding exactly what she was marrying into, choosing it anyway on her own terms, rather than anyone else's. That, in the end, is the only outcome I was ever really hoping for. The whole reason I set down my fork at all that night, and the whole reason I do it again, without hesitation, at any table, in any language, for as long as I have breath left to use one. If you have ever sat quietly at someone else's table, understanding far more than you were letting on, what would it take for you to finally set down your fork?